James Palmer, thank you so much for joining us from Washington, D.C. We've seen the second round of core commander meetings between India and China take place, and they took place, again, it was at least 11 hours. We don't have details of it, but the only thing that we are told is that India is focusing or sticking to its stand that there has to be a return or restoration to the status quo as of May 2nd, especially in the Finger 4 to Finger 8 area, Pangong Tso. But the fact that it's gone so long, we don't even know whether there's going to be another round again, like tomorrow. But what does that indicate to you in terms of both sides?
Well, on the Chinese side, it can mean that they're trying one of the favorite diplomatic tactics of the Chinese, which is basically wearing the other side down. And they may be, for instance, swapping out people, bringing in fresh negotiation teams, forcing you to go through the same points again and again with new people. These are all techniques that the Chinese have been using since the 1960s or later in multiple forms of negotiation. But it also may be that there's problems for the Chinese commanders because, of course, everything they do is going to have to be checked back up at the highest possible level. So the autonomy on the ground is probably pretty low at the moment, especially with everything so sensitive. So if you're the Chinese commander in that situation, there's multiple levels. There's what's best for the country, but there's also what does Xi Jinping think? What does this mean for my career? What are the people around me going to say to my bosses, to the party, and so on? Do any of the underlings want my job and feel might say that I'm not sufficiently nationalistic, especially at this time of like profound domestic political paranoia in China? There's multiple kind of concerns that weigh in on any Chinese negotiator.
What do you make of the run-up, and especially the June 15th events, which have not happened in 53 years in terms of the number of people who have been killed? At least India has given out the number of people who have been killed. We don't even know what's happening with the PLA. But reports suggesting that U.S. intelligence is giving stories to the American media that this was actually something that was ordered by General Zhao Zongqi, the Western Theater Command leader.
I think we have to be very careful about those claims because US intelligence at the moment is very leaky for political purposes. We've already seen with the pandemic that there have been leaks of these supposed reports that turned out to be, really nothing more than sort of Wikipedia level material, where some intern has put together, like at DHS has put together a 4-page document claiming that the virus originated, from a Wuhan lab or whatever. And then other sources within the American intelligence community would push back on that. So these kind of single-sourced things, when we don't even know what agency was involved, whether it was a high-level agency like the CIA or a low-level one like DHS, we really can't tell the reliability of that. And it seems unlikely to me that the Chinese would go ahead and order an attack directly. I can see them giving orders which might set up the situation in which this kind of conflict, which seems to have started as a very typical kind of border fight, and I think the thing we have to remember is these situations are incredibly tense. You have these young men on both sides. Often they're a long way from home. They're in this bizarre environment, this very physically strenuous environment. And you come across other people at dusk, and maybe you're not even certain which side of the border you're on because everything in the Himalayas changes so easily with rocks and water flow and so on. And so these situations seem much more likely to me to erupt from sort of just natural conflicts or low-level conflicts than to be ordered. Now, that said, in past times of heightened political tensions in China, like the Cultural Revolution in 1966 to 1976, of course, we saw deliberate border attacks on the Soviets, partially, we think, in order to bolster people's political positioning at home. So if you look at, for instance, the clash over Zhenbao Island, or Domensky Island, as the Russians call it, that was a very deliberate... 69 on the northern border. Now, this was a situation where you had these kind of low-level clashes, physical clashes for months, but without any casualties or without any serious injuries. You'd had people sort of scuffling and fighting on the ice and so on, and the Chinese side, running over, waving the little red book. But then there was this very deliberate ambush of a Soviet patrol. And again, we don't really know, because even today those times are so opaque, and the PLA in particular is super opaque. But it seems like that was probably a political move by somebody on the Chinese side, somebody trying to demonstrate the degree of their kind of fervency, their loyalty. So it's not impossible, but it seems pretty unlikely to me at this point. In the clash itself, I think until we start getting really first-hand accounts, and we won't have first-hand accounts from the Chinese side, except maybe some stuff that sort of filters through social media very indistinctly. I think that, what I suspect we'll find is the sheer level of fog of war involved, of people not knowing what's happening, whether the other side has fully attacked, of accidental deaths that then cause more deaths in this sort of real chain of violence.
Right. Reports that we get is that the commanding officer was attacked, and then bedlam all hell broke loose.
Yeah,
but
knocked off the cliff, possibly.
When you look at, when you're saying that you have to look at U.S. intelligence and why it's been leaked, but would you at least look towards, even if it wasn't an attack that was ordered, you do see military exercises that were being carried out there in February, in March. There was a mass movement from those 3 separate exercises, all the way from Karakoram to Tibet, of forces towards the line of actual control. So there was some kind of predetermined attempt to what, would you say?
I would say a mixture of the kind of infrastructure construction that has been a major part of Chinese efforts on the border for the last few years, this building up of resources, of manpower and of bases, but also perhaps an attempt to basically alter the line by boots on the ground, to just push forward, maybe see if the Indians didn't object or didn't object strongly enough, and just set a new reality. And I think that kind of push for kind of reshaping things right here and right now. We've seen that in China's strategy in the South China Sea. We've seen we're just going to build a new island. We're just going to do this, and other people object. But if there's only so much objection you can do before you start getting to the risk of actual war, which people are not willing to take over, a new island, or maybe over 10 meters of the border, or this kind of thing. So these sort of like tried and see strategies, I think, are something that we've seen a lot more from China under Xi Jinping, and that we'll probably see even more of in the future. And though perhaps in this case, because there's been so much bloodshed and because the risk has become much more acute, we might actually see that kind of dial back, or the tactic not be tried for a while.
Do you actually see the situation de-escalating?
I think it's possible. I mean, the truth is, escalation really serves nobody's interests except for maybe the danger, I think, is miscommunication, because both India and China are very prone to this sort of great power projection, where instead of trying to understand how the other side's system works and how the other side thinks and behaves, they mirror their own system onto the other. So on the Chinese side, for instance, the Chinese really don't understand that India is a democracy. Like, they have quite high levels of the party and the PLA have real trouble grasping principles like military-civilian separation or multi-party democracy, and so they tend to see conspiracy where there is none, or they don't understand why an action is or isn't taken. And then on the Indian side, it's often hard for, I think, Indians or anybody who isn't Chinese to understand quite how intricate and cutthroat the politics inside the CCP can be. So that danger is always there, but I think that I think that fundamentally the the deaths themselves may end up serving as a warning. And, one of the sort of hopeful signs on that on the China side, the Chinese have very much downplayed those deaths. They haven't emphasized them in state media. It's been...
Why?
So basically, in order not to constrain their own action, because although China is a dictatorship, dictatorships are still sensitive to public opinion. And one of the most dangerous areas for public opinion in China is nationalism, because nationalism is something that's, of course, officially approved by the government, but it's also something that can run out of control, where public demand can be stronger than the government's will. For instance, Chinese nationalists often complain that the government doesn't do enough to protect Chinese abroad, that they don't protect Chinese in Indonesia or Malaysia, for instance, that they didn't protect Chinese in Vietnam in the late 1970s. And one of the things is by not releasing the deaths, by not releasing the names or the images or any of this, you don't create martyrs on the Chinese side. And China, like India, of course, we know the Indian language of martyrdom. The Chinese have the same tradition, have the same idea of kind of, death in battle for the country. So by not making the soldiers, however many of them died on the border, into national martyrs, the Communist Party is trying to avoid giving the people kind of that call for action, that call for blood, which might limit the party's own action. Now, if they were escalate, if they really wanted to escalate, and if there was a big push for conflict, we would see those images dominating Chinese TV. We would see, coffins, and we would hear about how the treacherous Indians attacked the innocent Chinese and so on. And instead, we're seeing it relegated to position 5 on People's Daily. So that's in some ways optimistic. It shows that at the very least, they're keeping their options open. But if we start to see that kind of language, and if we start to see the kind of warning language of, these lines must not be crossed, we have been severely tested and so on, that have indicated previous confrontations, that would be a good thing. I mean, that would not be a good thing. That would be a bad sign. That would be a bad sign.
But then again, if you look forward into how these countries, when you look at the history, the images that they have of themselves, of course, looking at reality as well in terms of the power equations between India and China, whether it's military or economic, loss of faith on both sides, how important that is. So how do you get both to move back and yet not give your domestic audience reason to pillory you for that?
I think it's very tough, and I think at some point, the governments just have to bite the bullet and accept a certain domestic beating for the sake of peace. And that's harder for the Indian side because it can't control the media. It can't stop these images coming out. It can't stop the criticisms if it pulls back. But I would hope that the Indian government also has the maturity and the wisdom, as it were, to go through with that. I think one of the other things that we sometimes forget on the Chinese side is it's been a very long time since China fought a war, and it may not really be ready for one. We've had lots of rounds of anti-corruption purges inside the PLA. We've had lots of questions about PLA culture and effectiveness and so on. I really wonder if it turns out that they suffered more casualties in this clash. That doesn't really mean anything because this was a very weird skirmish. It's not as if any actual war is going to be fought, with boards and sticks. But I do wonder if there might have been some kind of are we ready kind of second guessing. Remember right now, if you were a 17, 18-year-old Chinese recruit in the last war that China fought in 1979, you retired a couple of years ago. There's literally nobody left inside the PLA who has any experience of actual warfare, bar a couple of tiny border skirmishes and the use of the military against the Chinese people itself. So that I think is a constraining factor that we sometimes underestimate. It's just that lack of experience and that almost not wanting to be the person who pushes that next war, who drags China into something that also it might not manage well.
Yeah, so rationally, both sides shouldn't want, but they shouldn't have even reached this stage.
Yes.
But when you look at history, the mistrust, this event now, and whatever's been done, say, since 1988 between India and China, all even rational, sane, sensible, they are ex-foreign secretaries, of course, heading in the foreign service at one point of time, are saying that whatever has been done is buried in the Galwan Valley for now, at least. So where do you see, how does India also has to, like you're pointing out, you have two strong leaders on both sides, and they are catering to their domestic audiences as well. Here it's at least to beg your pardon, voters. So how does that pan out? I mean, because India has to be seen to be doing something.
I think it's very tough, and I think what we may get is a lot of kind of flag waving until the issue is superseded in the news cycle by something.
Yeah.
And once it's taken out of the news cycle, you can do the quieter diplomacy and pull it back. And right now in India, of course, we're looking. It seems like the pandemic is getting to the point where that may well take over the news cycle from these deaths, and I think that'll be used by the government as an opportunity to kind of lower things down a bit. It's
but are the fronts necessarily going to have to be open, whether they're politically, economically, trade, tariff, Huawei, Taiwan, Hong Kong, Uyghurs, South China Sea, Australia?
I think we're going to see a lot more Indian alignment with the US in the next year or two as a result of this, and whether that's a permanent shift or whether that's signaling to China that China crossed a line and these are the consequences, that I don't know. But I think we'll see much more cooperation in the Indian Ocean towards these sort of, Asia-Pacific strategies. I think we'll see alignment on tech issues, which has really emerged as the one of the big kind of crisis points. So we'll see India lining up not only with the US, but also potentially with, the UK, Canada, Australia, as they push back against Chinese cyber intrusion, against Huawei and so on, and I think we'll see a lot more public closeness to America on military issues that will be very directed at China. Now, maybe in a couple of years, the Chinese make conciliatory gestures and flip back, but the truth is, the way that Chinese politics is heading, I think their capability for conciliation is getting lower and lower.
In terms of that conciliation and whether it's issues, and one of the issues that has been very close to your heart, especially since you've been in China and reported from there and written from there, looked at its history for over 15 years, was the issue of the Uyghurs. And I remember an interview, I think in 2018, when you were absolutely distraught on television because you were trying to explain that, journalists like you could not have any personal contacts anymore because you were putting people in danger and you had to rely on OSINT, on satellite imagery, etc. The Uyghur law that has been signed by President Trump, is that just a slap in the face like what's happened with the State Department and 4 new media publications being named as foreign missions, or is it actually imposing a cost on China that could change its behavior?
I think it's imposing a cost on China, a relatively minor cost, but one that's there. I don't think it's going to change behavior because I think that ethno-nationalism, that feeling of Han superiority and that total kind of desire to crush Uyghur culture and minority culture in general in the West, that's unstoppable in the Chinese political system at the moment. It's not a rational objective, really. It's one that they're going to see the US as conspiring against them by imposing that cost. I don't think there's really much that could make the Chinese pull back from their policies in Xinjiang as a whole. Now, that said, global attention does seem to have reduced the scale of the camps themselves, and caused some releases. There have been successful releases from the camps, but the whole of Xinjiang has been turned into this surveillance society, one in which the Uyghur language, Uyghur culture, Uyghur religion is severely oppressed. And we're also seeing people moved from the camps to the prison system. So, the relatives of friends of mine, retired couples, have been given sentences of 10 years or more for for basically nothing, for having contact with the outside world, basically. The only way that I think China will change on that in the long term is if Xi Jinping falls, in which case there may be policy cover to undergo a kind of rectification on this, to move back towards more conciliatory policies. But that's very hard to know if anything like that will happen. I do think the Chinese elite are becoming more and more conscious of losing access to the world. And we saw that with Mang in Canada. The ultra rich have always kind of assumed that they would be able to kind of go between like their Canadian home and their Chinese home, that they would be able to make their money from rent seeking in China, from corruption, from captive populations and so on, from high level ties, and then to live with that more degree of freedom elsewhere. And I think cutting those links, cutting those ties, and imposing costs on that sort of business political elite may start to have some effects in making them more discontent with Xi Jinping. And they were already pretty unhappy with him. I mean, the feeling I always got in the last sort of year or two when I was in China was really that at the very least the rich thought it wasn't necessarily that they ideologically disagreed with him. They were fairly patriotic. They wanted China to have a place in the world and so on, but they thought that his tactics were wrong. They thought that he was pushing too hard, too fast, and was causing these costs. Though with the degree of control in China at the moment and the degree to which Shiism and the Shiist personality cult has come to dominate, when something does happen, if something does happen, it's going to be a real kind of revealed preference cascade. If Xi Jinping, gets sick and retires, suddenly everybody is going to talk about how they disliked Xi Jinping all along. But barring something big, nobody says anything. We see only these kind of marginal critiques from IR scholars and dissidents.
Well, actually, that was going to be my next question, and in relation, not really in relation, but bringing up your book, Death of Mao, The Tungsten Earthquake, Birth of a New China, and I was going to ask you what you thought about Xi Jinping, and was there any internal dissent? Would anything change? But you've already answered that question. So, James Farmer, again, thank you so much for joining us and sharing your thoughts. It's been an absolute pleasure.
Thank you very much.
And you can get all the latest news and analysis on our website, StratNewsGlobal.com. You can also follow us on Twitter, Facebook, as well as Instagram. And if you want to get notifications for videos like this when we put them up and reminders, you can just click on the bell icon on our YouTube channel. You're watching StratNews Global. I'm Amitabh Revi.